So I'm going to start a little bit out of left field. We've been talking about how we are in Matthew, taking a break from Matthew and Proverbs. And Proverbs is topical, all right? So we're forced to systematize the book of Proverbs and grab different verses that talk on a certain topic. And here's kind of coming out of left field where I want to start. When I first started learning Greek, one of the things you have to do, and I'm assuming this is true of learning all other languages, you actually have to figure out how you learned English first. So there's parts of language, what are adjectives, verbs, nouns, all that stuff. But you also learn how to pronounce things. And so we actually spent 2 weeks in Greek, not just learning the alphabet, but in understanding pronunciation. And so there's actually, and I didn't know this at the time, this is years ago when I learned this, but there are 3 ways that we pronounce certain things, okay? So we have something called dentals. These are sounds that we make with our teeth, right? So those are dentals. We have labals. Those are words that we make with our lips. So b, right? This is kindergarten all over again, okay? So labals and dentals. And then we have something called palatals. These are kind of a mix between what we use with our palate and our throats. So this is like a sound that's coming from your throat. You guys get it. G, right? G. Anyway, right? More of those. You want more of those? No. So I say that because that's honestly, those 3 ways are how we get all of our sounds. Now, of course, different languages use different or emphasize those sounds differently, right? But and even in some languages, like in English, we combine some of those sounds. For example, when you want to say the letter X, you're using your throat and your teeth, or the letter F, right? You're using your lips with your teeth in combination. All you're doing it right now, or mentally you want to do. I can see you as you're like trying to want to just relax. All right. Now here's why I say that. What we do is we take those sounds, and I hope this will make sense in a second. We take those sounds, this ability to take those 3 sounds, and we form words. So when I say the word bat, I'm using all 3, right? I'm using my lips, my teeth, and my throat. Bat, right? I'm communicating a word. Now, obviously, you can see where we're going, but here's what's kind of wild, and I'm going to sound kind of mystical, new agey, but just give me some grace as we get there, okay? When I have a thought in my head about something, I take those sounds and I form a word like bat, right? And in a proper context, I can actually have the thing that I'm thinking in my mind be in your mind with the right context. We're at a baseball field. Go grab me the bat. Now, when I say bat, I'm not thinking now the black winged thing right now. In the right context, I say bat, right? I've now made you think about, you are imagining a bat. Bat is in your mind. Now, of course, if it were in a different language, it would be something different altogether. Now, that's crazy. I want us to just meditate on that for a second. That's a wild thought. For the ability for me to have a word or an image in my brain and go, Bible. Now, in your mind, you're thinking of a Bible. We're now what we call communicating. I'm pressing this in. But here's what's wild about language, and this is why it takes so long, and I think language is so fascinating, especially English, which is a living language. We wouldn't know what people spoke 500 years ago in English. We wouldn't be able to communicate with them. The fact that it's ongoing. What a wild thought. But we don't just communicate just mere bat or Bible, right, or cup, right? But more than that, we can take these words and communicate complex ideas. And not just communicate them, but I can actually implant, go Leo on you, implant in your mind ideas. So some of you are sitting here and going like, you feel like you're not seen. And like, I'm telling you, you are seen. And I know there's times when you feel like you don't have friends and nobody cares about you, but people do care about you. If you'd reach out to them, they do care about you. I'm not getting emotional, I choked, okay? Now here's my point. Like, in that moment, I'm communicating with all of those sounds to create words. I'm actually changing the way that you feel. Can you stop talking while I'm preaching? Thank you very much. It's awkward for you to be able to do that. Now, do you feel that right now? Do you feel what I just did? Nobody's talking back there, okay? You're like, okay. Do you feel the moment? Do you feel what words? Everyone's like, oh gosh, get me out of here. I've been waiting like a week to do that. Now, you can feel that. Do you feel what words do? Now I'm communicating not just an idea in your head, but you're feeling something. That's crazy that I can do that with 3 different types of sounds. 3 different types of sounds, I can communicate this. Now, I'm not going mystical or new agey. What do we do with this? I want you to know I got saved into the charismatic name it, claim it theology movement. And I want to just say, that's not where I'm going. In that world, you can speak your destiny into existence. There is something worthy of praising God that he's the only one that can do that. For example, in Hebrews 3:11, it tells us all things that are made out of things that are invisible, and God created all things. Or we're told in Romans 4:17 that he made, or those things that are not, he spoke those things that are not as though that they are. So God, when God says, bat, there's actually a bat that appears, right? Now, that's not, I'm not saying we have that power, but what's weird is the book of Genesis starts in the first chapter with this God who's speaking those things into existence, and then we're told at the end of that first chapter that we're made in his image. Now, I don't think we can speak our existence into, or speak our destiny into existence. I think that's all trash in the name it, claim it, prosperity gospel. But what I am saying is there is power in the ability to communicate this way. That's fascinating. That's a brilliant thing. Now, Proverbs knows that, okay? The Bible knows that. And so, because that's true, as James 3 says, we all struggle in many things. If you don't struggle with your tongue, you are a perfect man. We recognize this power is not always wielded properly. We don't handle this ability to be able to communicate a good thought and change the way you feel, or a bad thought and change the way you feel. We're not good at that. And so Proverbs, God in his wisdom says, there are things you need to know about your tongue, about your words, that I want you to be aware of, all right? And so that's the kind of idea that we're going to jump into. We're going to try to bracket some of these things. We're going to look at the first verse that was read there, that Gabby read for us, and then we're going to bracket some different ideas. And I want to say this before we jump into these verses. Last week I got up and I was super grateful to be a Christian in our religion because the Bible's telling us not to be lazy, and I am naturally wired to not be lazy. This week, I'm the opposite, okay? I'm telling you, I'm asking for grace to not see me as a hypocrite because I put my foot in my mouth more oftentimes than I'm not. I'm not good in this area, so I'm not teaching it as if I have perfected it. I'm quite the opposite. I'm listening to Proverbs and learning from it, okay? With that being said, let's read our verse that we had that Gabby came up and read. This is what the verse says. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. If you haven't been with us before, we're going to break down the verses. I'm honestly going to just spend about 5 minutes breaking this verse down, and then I'm going to show you what I see in the other probably 30 verses that talk about the tongue and words in the book of Proverbs. But let's look at this first verse second. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Now, based on everything I just said up to this point, I think it's clear. I don't think that's just hyperbole. Okay? I mean, people have literally killed themselves because of what others have said to them, because of the way they've been made to feel, right? So there is something to be said about death and life, quite literally being in the power of the tongue. Like there's an ability to communicate an idea and implant not just bat or Bible or cup in your brain, but to communicate to yourself, you're worthless. You're worthless and you shouldn't live, right? Or, no, you're valuable and you should. The ability to be able to do that. As a matter of fact, Proverbs, I'm going to try to give you as many Proverbs as I can, gives us these ideas. So for example, Proverbs 10:18 tells us we can slander with our mouth. Proverbs 11:13 tells us we can gossip with our mouth. Proverbs 12:22 says we can lie with our mouth. And Proverbs 24:28 tells us we can deceive with our mouth. Those are all things that bring death, right? But at the same time, Proverbs acknowledges that you can bring life. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. In Proverbs 16:24, you could say things that are pleasant. In Proverbs 22:11, you could say things that are gracious. In Proverbs 12:25, you can cheer someone up with your words. And in Proverbs 27:2, you can compliment someone with your words. So that's clear. Now, how you choose to wield this and where you fail and where you succeed in the way that you speak, right? You are forced at the end of this verse, those who love it will eat its fruits. The NLT communicates that back half there. Those who love to talk reap the consequences. Meaning, if you speak things of death, you are going to reap the product, right, of that. Maybe not just directly on yourself, you're going to start thinking those things, but people will not want to be around you, right? You're going to experience the consequences of how you use your mouth, right? With that being said, here's what I want to do, okay, for our time. If that's true, when I scoured Proverbs, I grabbed every single proverb that I could, and I'm trying to, it's really difficult. It's so much easier in Matthew in a narrative portion of Scripture because it's just clear. Here's what it says. When, you've got 31 chapters and it's scattered throughout, you're trying to grab these, you got to find a way to bracket them. And so I found 4 different brackets, the way that the book of Proverbs talks about. And maybe you're going, actually, there's a better way to bracket. I'm not saying this is the best way. This is just the way that I figured out how to do it, okay? There are 2 big brackets that the book of Proverbs talks about, and then there are these 2 tiny brackets that the book of Proverbs talks about when it talks about using our words, all right? Here's the first bracket. And I'm going to give you just a small little story. Me and my boy growing up have a buddy who, a mutual friend who, he's one of those guys, this is like a year ago too, he has to post on social media about everything. He has an opinion about everything. And he's one of these guys, he works in a gun shop, but he's anti-guns. I'm not kidding. He's anti-guns and he works at a gun shop. He comments on comments and comments and comments. And eventually he commented on something, posted something, I don't remember what it was, and my boy commented the most brilliant thing, and it's obviously a statement in our culture, but it's just this 2-word statement that I think is brilliant. He just put in his comments, talk less. Talk less. And that idea is that first bracket. I think Proverbs, in a big bracket, tells you and I, as followers of God, to talk less. Talk less. I'm talking to myself right now. Sean, talk less. Listen, let's look at these verses, all right? I said we're going to look at these as many verses as we can. Proverbs 13:3 says, whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Talk less. Proverbs 21:23, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Talk less. Proverbs 17:28, even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Proverbs 29:20, do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Proverbs 10:19, when words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Proverbs is wise in here, calling out a few different things. If you're sitting in a room with someone who's foolish, even when they're not talking, you're like, I don't know what that dude's about to say, but he's about to drop a wisdom bomb. Now, when eventually he talks, you're like, oh, okay, he's not smart. But while he's quiet, you're going, there's something about it that talk less. Or even when you're in a room, and I know cops experience this at great length, and I do in pastoral counseling all the time, when the guilty party elaborates the story, gives all these details, you're like, bro, it's so obvious. You're like making this up on the fly right now, right? Talk less. This is what Proverbs is acknowledging in this moment, that there's this sense that as humans, we want to talk a lot. As a matter of fact, data shows that we spend 20% of our life, and I'm not a big stats guy, I never come up here and share stats. I thought it was fascinating, and I don't know how they do these social sciences and how they figure this out, but 20% of our life, 1/5 of our life is talking. So much so, and this is what 2 of the research projects came up with, that we could, in the course of a year, on average, the average American can write 160 books, 200 pages each, okay? So that's on average, if you do the math. I was thinking about this last night. We write a book with our words that's 200 pages long every 3 days. That's how much we're talking, right? And so when I read these verses, it's going like, talk less, as President Calvin Coolidge said, I've never regretted words I didn't say, right? Just talk less. With that being said, let me read a couple other verses that I think are worth, outside of Proverbs, that acknowledge this talking less idea. In James 1:19, it says, know this, my beloved brothers, that every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. In Psalm 141, verse 3, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth, keep watch over the door of my lips. And then back to Proverbs 18:2, I think is great. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his own opinion. One of my favorite stories, we don't get a lot of humor in the Bible, but one of my favorite stories is in Mark's account of the Transfiguration in Mark chapter 9. What happens is Peter and some other disciples are standing with Jesus, and Moses and Elijah appear before the disciples, and they're glowing. And Peter ends up making this declaration, should we build these 3 shelters for you, these tabernacles? What should we do, right? Should we get you food? What are we supposed to do? Here's Moses, Elijah, and Jesus just glowing. They're like this fascinating moment. And it says, Peter says this at the end of it, it says, because he didn't know what to do, he said this, right? I don't know what to say, so I'm going to say something, right? And so I think there is a sense amidst who knows how many more blogs we honestly need in this world, and YouTubers and social media platforms and influencers. Everybody with talking heads wants to say something, while Proverbs is being countercultural and going, I know you want to say something, but talk less. Talk less. And I just, by way of warning, back to Matthew, there is a sense in all this that it's not just talk less for the sake of talking less, but and I don't know how to say this without just saying it, but the more words you say ups the chances of you being judged. Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37 say this: I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So you're going to stand before God for 1/5 of your life of what you've done in speaking, and you're going to go, all right, God, here's what God's going to say, here's what you've said, and he's going to judge you based on that, okay? So the first bracket, for whatever it's worth, talk less. Now, I don't want to let the introverts, because every introvert in the house is like, I've been saying that forever, right? I live in by myself, okay? Proverbs does talk about speaking, though. So it's not just talk less. We're not saying don't talk, but there's this other side of it. When you do talk, speak words of healing. So Proverbs now, another big bracket is talk less, but when you do speak kind words. Now notice I didn't say just speak words that only make people feel good, because there's peacemaking moments where you speak words that are gentle, but you're trying to fix a situation. These are good things, and you know where your heart is at with those things. Listen to these Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18 says, there is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Right? So we want to be wise in bringing healing. Proverbs 16:24, gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. Proverbs 15:23, a person finds joy in giving an apt reply, and how good is a timely word. I'm mindful of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. This is what it says. It says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that they may benefit those who listen. That word unwholesome, the root word of it, the original root word for it in Greek, is actually the idea of rotten fruit. You consume ripe, good fruit. Don't spew out rotten, bad fruits, right? But rather, instead of doing that, you can see it, we should say words that are helpful, edifying, meeting the needs, and beneficial. I think this is why Colossians 4 tells us our speech should be seasoned with salt. Same idea, okay? So talk less, but when you do talk, speak words of healing, all right? Now, I want to stop real quick, because I think what Proverbs is doing is encapsulating the most, or maybe I'll say this, the most popular verse when it comes to speaking is in James chapter 3. I think James chapter 3 encapsulates all the Proverbs that speak about the tongue, okay? James 3 gets at this idea. And so I'd be a fool to not read James chapter 3, at least part of it, because some of you are aware of James 3 when it talks about don't desire to be a teacher, and then it gets into the power of the tongue and all that stuff. So I just want to read part of it so that you can see this is not just Proverbs, a one-off seeing this, but ultimately this death and life being in the power of the tongue and speaking words of healing does matter. And it's not just here in Proverbs, but there's a synopsis of it in James 3. So listen to what it says. For every kind of beast and bird, this is in verse 7 of chapter 3, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Let me just stop right there. Remember what we said. You have this ability to implant ideas into people's minds, changing the way that they feel, okay? And we don't do this well. And so Proverbs is calling us, and James 3 is calling us to tame that, discipline that. Because this thing is powerful. Words are powerful. God has given us the ability to do this as mankind for a reason. And so he goes on to say, we can tame all kinds of animals, but for some reason, we can't tame this thing. He goes on to say, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. His point is, you and I, as believers, live in a tension, don't we? We just sing songs to God, and yet you say these terrible things that you're thinking, you know you shouldn't communicate them to that person, and you say them anyway. Now, I know there's different ways of communicating. I think nonverbal communication is a huge part of that. But we're talking specifically on words. When you say those things, how can you say those things to that person? And I'm not saying long statements. We're talking quick, like sharp cutting remarks. You know when you do that. and yet at the same time you sing these beautiful songs to the Lord. How do these things work together? This is confusing. You should work on, this matters enough that it should be a discipline you work on. Now, the John Piper of the Jewish world is a guy named Rabbi Joseph Telenik. I can never pronounce his last name. I wrote it down like 3 times. Telunu. No, I can pronounce it. Telenu. You guys will see his name up there. I have a quote from him, okay? Telishkuin. Anyway, he's like if you've ever seen something from maybe a Jewish rabbi, I'm not saying everything he says that he agrees with. I agree with. He's not a Christian, obviously, but he wrote these Jewish ethics based on the Old Testament law. And I remember reading them a while ago when he got to Leviticus. I was reading through like how he talks about our speech, and then in Proverbs he talks about the Jewish ethic about this. And I thought this was pretty amazing the way that he talks about this. Listen to what he says. He says, if you cannot go 24 hours without drinking liquor, you're addicted to alcohol. If you cannot go 24 hours without smoking, you're addicted to nicotine. Similarly, if you cannot go 24 hours without saying unkind words about others, then you have lost control over your tongue, right? The idea is that when you think of sexual addiction, when you think of you're somebody who struggles with alcohol, or you struggle like, man, I can't stop doing this, you work on that thing. And yet here is Proverbs telling us that this power exists between human beings to communicate certain things. And yet you can't go a day without that sharp tongue cutting. And so talk less, and when you do talk, bring words of healing. Now again, I am the least in this. I fail at this often, and so it is a discipline. There are many times, many times where I'm sitting and I feel like I know the answer to this. There are many times, even in elder meetings, a lot of times, and I talk a lot, there are moments where I'm like, I want to say something, and it's a discipline. It's a conscious decision to talk less. The Bible is calling us to this, and when I do talk, I want to bring words of healing. Now, I said there are 2 smaller brackets. So the first big bracket is where Proverbs is calling us to talk less. The second big bracket is that when we do talk, we should bring words of healing. But there are 2 smaller brackets that I think Proverbs, and it's only 4 verses between the 2 brackets, but they were there, so I had to do something with them, and I thought it was appropriate what the wisdom of God gives us in this. The first small bracket is the way we use our words will help us in our approach to tension, okay? Proverbs addresses the fact that there are moments, I know it sounds crazy, on social media where there's tension, or there's moments where you want to say something, or someone says something to you, and Proverbs actually tells you how to respond with your words. Listen to this. In Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 15:4, 3 verses later, a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. So one of my first adult jobs, ministry jobs even, is I was 17 years old, and I got to be the janitor, one of the janitors at this church that I was at. And there was a guy named Roy who was like the king janitor. He was the janitor. We were all his like little lackeys, right? So we had part-time, high school students who kind of did what he said. And he was an awesome dude. To this day, one of the most godly men that I know. Wasn't an educated man, just grinded. Just a classic, loves the Lord, kept the place clean, made everyone feel welcome. Just an amazing dude. And he was making us use these vacuums. So I'm in the children's area using this vacuum, and it just sucks. And I don't mean sucks in a good way. It doesn't suck. That's the problem. And so I'm vacuuming, and it's not working. And so I go to Roy, and I'm heated. And I go, Roy, you make us use these vacuums, and I hate these vacuums. Why? Right? And I'm so angry. 17-year-old Sean, very angry. And I'll never forget, and he not in a demeaning, because people can do this in a demeaning way. He's like, dude, Sean, I'm so sorry, man. I didn't know you felt that way. And I'm so angry, right? And he says that, and I'm like, yeah, well, I do. I do feel that way, right? And I felt myself tearing up as a 17-year-old. I'm like, yeah, man, he just diverted that all that emotion and anger, just this soft anger turned away wrath. I'm like, so we're not gonna fight right now? Okay, that's cool, right? Proverbs calls this out in this moment of tension. When you want to escalate, Proverbs says, soft answer. Use your words in this moment to de-escalate. I think that's so cool, right? So that's one small bracket. And then the last small bracket, I think is clear. It tells us to use our words to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Okay? Now, Proverbs has a lot to say about the poor, a lot to say about the poor. So much so that I thought I was in tension in talking about the tongue or the poor, because how much Proverbs says is how much we should give helping hands to those who can't help themselves. But this is exactly what Proverbs 31:8 says. It says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Now, the weird thing about where we stand, and I'm not trying to make political statements, but naturally as humans, we want to fight for ourselves. That's a very natural thing. What's weird about the United States platform, the US or Western platform that we have in fighting for ourselves, is there are all these people around the world. Let's give the topic at hand. I don't want, if we're going to get into women's rights and the conversation of overturning Roe v. Wade, right? I'm not saying that's not a conversation that shouldn't be had. It should be a conversation that should be had, right? Fine, we want to have that conversation. But man, like, you know how many women in other countries are like so much lower on the totem pole than what you're describing right now? It doesn't make it less. I'm just saying there's a sense that like, man, there are women who are being raped and murdered just because they're women. I mean, you go to South America and some of these places, you do not want to be a woman. Let's fight for their rights, right? There's a sense that Proverbs says you do have a voice, and if you do have a voice, don't just use it for yourself. As a matter of fact, more often, use it for those who can't speak for themselves. This is why, I mean, at the core, for so many believers, Proverbs is calling out what the rest of the Bible calls us in being pro-life. Here's a group of humans that can't speak for themselves that we want to advocate for, right? And so there's a sense that for us, when we read Proverbs, that we should understand that we have a voice and a power to communicate, not just a platform and all that, but have a voice, and we can communicate for those who can't communicate for themselves, all right? So I think that's worth bringing up. With that being said, I've only got 4 minutes to finish. I thought there were some practical things that I thought would be worth bringing up for us to close and then pray, and then I promise we're done, okay? 2 things, just real quickly before we peace out, all right? Number 1, in Matthew chapter 12, which we're going to get to in a couple months, Jesus tells us that those sounds, labils, dentals, palatals, those sounds don't just randomly happen, okay? Now, when you make those sounds, as I make these sounds right now to form sentences, they come from somewhere. They come from somewhere. Now, we immediately assume they come from our mind, but that's not where Jesus says they come from. Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 says they come from our heart, okay? Out of our heart, the mouth speaks. Now, the way that Jews view the heart and the mind are different than the way that we view the heart and the mind. The point is, it comes from somewhere deep, which tells us something, right? What you're saying tells, it's showing us that to some level, what you're saying shows us where you're at. And there's a clear call for Christians that when you became a Christian, your heart was changed. And so when your heart changes, here it is, your words should change. You should take this serious enough to go, man, like, it's not that I'm just going to be judged. It's not that Proverbs is just telling me. But if this is a heart issue and my heart is changed, then my words should change. How I speak should change. Who I speak for should change. How I speak in being gentle. When I don't speak, that should change. We don't just see these 2 big points and 2 small points as just points, let me, like therapeutic deism, let me just get it done, it's moralistic. No, there's a heart issue here. And Jesus calls that heart issue out. The second thing is, more often than not, introvert or extrovert, I find human beings speaking the most when 2 things are happening. Number 1, when they know their rights, and number 2, when they're being misrepresented, okay? When you know your rights and you know you're being misrepresented, something wants to explode within you to be able to communicate those things, right? And I just want to encourage you that the man that we follow was in that exact situation and remained silent. And in the moment where he was being lied about and slapped in his face, when things were being communicated about him that were not true and he knew what the truth was, he, quote, remained silent. And we see him and we follow him and we go, I want to communicate this. I have so much. Talk less, and when you do talk, only words of healing. I think there's something there, right? Let me finish. I have 3 weeks in a row quoting Spurgeon. I want to keep my streak alive. Let me finish. This is from one of his morning and evenings. He says, if our lips do not speak uprightly, truthfully, and justly, if our tongue is not salted and sanctified by the grace of God, then we cannot claim the Bible as our text. God grant that we may prove by our conversation that the Lord has changed us in our inner man. Then listen to this. Beware of letting your tongue outrun your brain. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you right now as a people that hear instruction, and that's good for us. There are moments when you beckon us in different ways of worship and in glorifying you, and now in instruction, we desire to do that. We desire to glorify you with our lives, specifically with our words. We want to honor you with our words. We want the world around us to see that you are a good God and glorify you because of what we say. And I pray, God, that you'd help us in that. Lord, 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 help us. Spirit, I pray you'd continue to help us in this journey. It is not easy. We fail often in it. I pray this would be true between spouses and between friends and family members and neighbors, that as believers, our hearts have been changed, and therefore we would communicate words of gentleness. There will be moments where we don't communicate at all. We remain silent. I pray you'd help us in that. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.